Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to take place in the fourth chapter in the book of Exodus. We're going to take this all the way up till the 17th verse, save the second half for a later lesson, but we just want to review what took place in Exodus prior to the fourth chapter. In the first chapter, we learned that the Hebrew nation becomes a nation within the nation of Egypt who eventually enslaves them. The rationale being that they were procreating too prolifically, and even while enslaved, they still conceive at a sufficiently alarming rate to compel one of the pharaohs, who was 400 years after, close to 400 years after the pharaoh who knew not Joseph, who initially enslaved them, that even as an enslaved people, they're growing too many. So he orders that all the male boys be tossed in the Nile River, and Moses, the one who comes to deliver the nation of Israel from Egypt, the great deliverer, his birth is a deliverance of death, which foretells and foreshadows the deliverance that he came to bring. He was the promised child. He was raised in Egyptian royalty, so he knew not the suffering and the hardships of the slaves. He was an Egyptian in culture, Hebrew by blood, and his identity crisis was being too Egyptian to be Hebrew and too Hebrew for the Egyptians. So he didn't really quite fit in anywhere. And then one day he mediates a dispute one day he kills an Egyptian who was oppressing, excessively abusing one of his Hebrew brothers. He took it upon himself to visit the Hebrews' slaves, and there he saw that. And then the thing is that the camp saw him kill this Egyptian taskmaster. So then the word eventually reaches up to Pharaoh, and he flees to Midian. He's wanted dead, so he's on the top 10 most wanted list in the land of Egypt. This takes us to the third chapter. So the life of Moses spans the range. He's the human protagonist of the Pentateuch, essentially. His life lasted 120 years. It can be conveniently divided into three periods of 40 years, the first 40 years of which he spent in pomp and ceremony of Egyptian royalty. He had the exposure to advanced education and all the refinements of civilization. Then for 40 years he became a shepherd in Midian. Midian is a land that is on the either side of the southern Sinai Peninsula and even West Arabia. They were of Abrahamic descent, and he is taken into the family. He marries the daughter of a priest by the name of Reuel, indicating that the descendants of Abraham had not strayed far from the true religion at all. I think eventually they succumbed to idolatry, but Reuel was an authentic link, and Moses was shepherding the flocks of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flocks to the back of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of Sinai. So, mountain of Elohim. Horeb is alternately translated as Sinai. It is known as Sinai, so a lot of significant things took place on the mountain of Sinai, among them the issuing of the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments, and also the original theophanic revelation of Yahweh to Moses, and Yahweh had not revealed himself to anyone, as far as the record is indicated, since Joseph, who had the ability to interpret dreams, which ultimately secures his family station in the nation of Egypt, and they eventually come to become a nation. But he's shepherding, so he was called from the sheep pen. Like David, he was called from the sheep pen to the throne, and he was called from the sheep pen to rule. So his earlier experience as royalty would have given him a comfort and a custom to command and control. But as we read in the fourth chapter, he has a crisis of self-confidence. And the angel of Yahweh appeared to him in a flame of fire from the midst of a bush. And he looked and saw the bush burning with fire, but the bush was not consumed. So this is an angelic mediator was there who appeared to him and was visible. And he was visible in a flame of fire, which a bush which was burning but was not consumed. This is a miracle which leads a lot of the miracles. So there's a lot of miracles that really take off happening beginning in the book of Exodus. And he eventually, he reveals himself in the 6th verse. I am the Elohim of your father, the Elohim of Abraham, the Elohim of Isaac, and the Elohim of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at Yahweh. So fear is the normative, natural, and human response to an awareness that you are in the presence of divinity or angels or anything spiritually superior. Fear, awe, and wonder. But the fear is almost all the times first off, Yahweh does not reveal himself basically only to those who are worthy, so the fear is alleviated with an assurance of fear not. But he also says that that his patriarchs are alive. This verse is used to as a Pentateuchal foundation for the doctrine of the resurrection that the Master himself brought into dispute with the Pharisees with their absurd question about the resurrection and the woman who married 7 brothers. They didn't even believe in the resurrection. Verse 8, I have come down to deliver them from the hand of Egypt, and to bring them up to a land that is good and spacious land, to a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites, and the Hittites, and the Amorites, and the Perizzites, and the Hivites, and the Jebusites. So this land was the land that had been lived in, and they looked upon it. The patriarchs of the faith wandered as nomads in this land's midst, that it was occupied by at least 7 nations, but it was a land of milk and honey, choice, agricultural, fertile land, and there's literally no country on earth quite like Israel. It has all the 4 seasons, but these 7 nations, they were abominable and wicked, and that is why the justification for the 400 years of bondage, because Yahweh is long-suffering, and he wanted to give them a window to repent. But finally, the cries of the Hebrews were loud enough, and the abominy of the Canaanites was loud enough to compel him to intervene and act dramatically. Verse 11, And Moses said to Elohim, Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh, and that I should bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? And he said, Because I am with you, and this is to be the sign that you have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you are to serve Elohim on this mountain. So Moses he's dwelling excessively and introvertedly on his own inadequacies and imperfections, but the remedy for the I am not, whatever we are not, we have the name I am. That's what Yahweh's name translates as he is revealed in response to a question. This is the sacred name, and it is a name to be a memorial, and it translates as I am that I am. So it is not I became, I used to be. It is I am eternal. He's the eternally self-existent one. Then there's a fantastic promise in verse 17. And say, I am bringing you up out of the affliction of Egypt to the land of the Canaanites and the Hittites and the Amorites and the Perizzites and the Hivites and the Jebusites, to a land flowing with milk and honey. So there's that promise renewed. It is a land flowing with milk and honey. Every agricultural delicacy you can put your fingers on will be there. And when they shall listen to your voice, and you shall come, and you and the elders of Israel, to the king of Egypt, and you shall say to him, Yahweh Elohim of the Hebrews is met with us, and now please let us go 3 days' journey into the wilderness to sacrifice to Yahweh our Elohim. So this, Moses is earlier questioned, why would Pharaoh even listen to me? But who among the Hebrew people was even qualified or familiar with the protocols of the palace life to even approach Pharaoh in petition? He was the only one who would have had that leverage. All the rest of them were slaves, although his brother Aaron is given as an assurance, as we eventually read. And I shall stretch out my hand and smite Egypt with my wonders, which I shall do in its midst. And after that I shall let you go. So his powerful outstretched arms is going to send 10 plagues before he sends the 10 commands to Israel. He sends the 10 demands to let his people go to Egypt. These are in the forms of miracles, which are wielded with Moses as the human vessel or instrument, or his staff will be his brother Aaron's staff will be the instrument of many of these miracles, which will accomplish their deliverance. So there's a lot this is just a fantastic promise, but as we read in the 4th chapter, Moses had a crisis of self-confidence. He was dwelling on the I am not rather than dwelling on the I am. It wasn't him and himself who was going to do these great, fantastic things. It was Yahweh working through him and in him and around him. verse 1, chapter 4, book of Exodus. And Moses answered and said, And if they do not believe me, nor listen to my voice, and say, Yahweh has not appeared to you. So the first thing that is established is there is no change of scenery. This is a dialogue. Previously, there's mostly Yahweh talking in the 3rd chapter, but the dialogue continues. This is the same scenery. It's not until then, in verse 18, that indicates change of scenery. So, and means just a continuation, and Moses answered in response to these fantastic promises with doubt, because he's looking inward rather than looking above and beyond himself. And if they do not believe me, nor listen to my voice, and say, Yahweh has not appeared to you. So he's doubting whether other people will believe and be faithful. So he's doubting his effectiveness as an evangelist, whether this testimony will be regarded or received as true. So he's struggling with the own credibility and his ability to pass off, I see you, I'm looking at you now, but how are people going to know when you are not literally there with me as you are now, that I have seen you as I am now? And Yahweh said to him, What is that in your hand? And he said, A rod. So in the first verse of the 3rd chapter, we read that Moses was shepherding, and a rod would have been a wooden stick, a staff to shoo away, to keep the sheep in line, to shoo away animals that might bother them, and also as a walking staff. So this rod, this ordinary instrument, this utilitarian instrument is going to be transformed into a vessel of the great signs and wonders that he has promised and proclaimed to come to pass. And he said, Throw it on the ground. So he threw it on the ground, and it became a serpent, and Moses fled from it. So this once wooden staff and rod is tossed on the ground, and just like that, it transforms into a serpent, a live serpent with a poisonous bite. So Moses flees from it. He is a fearful response to another. Just because a serpent struck terror and delight in it's human nature. We have an instinctive revulsion to serpents, although some do grow comfortable with handling them. But serpents means, it's something satanic to the Hebrew people, but it was also something royal to the Egyptians. It was not uncommon for many of the Pharaoh's thrones to have a metal snake going out, and that was a symbol of his sovereignty. And Yahweh said to Moses, Reach out your hand and catch it by the tail. So he reached out his hand and seized it, and became a rod in his hand. So at the toss to the ground, it becomes something it wasn't, and then at the touch of it on the ground, it returns to what it was. So he's naturally fearful for the serpent, but if he approaches him from the rear and snags him by the tail, his mere touch, all he has to do is lay the first finger on the snake. It will not bite him. It will return to a rod in its hands. It will be what it once was, and he can throw it on the ground again, and the same thing is going to happen. Whatever he commands, whatever he promises will come true. So if he just promised all these fantastic things, these wonderful promises in the 3rd chapter, and he just promised him this, then he has no reason to not believe. It's a gradual process when Moses comes into his calling. So they believe that Yahweh Elohim of their fathers, the Elohim of Abraham, the Elohim of Isaac, and the Elohim of Jacob has appeared to you. So this sign is supposed to be for the Hebrew people. They're going to look at that and witness and know that they have been visited by their patriarchs, whose names were probably preserved. They had a record. They had the genealogical records of as recorded in Chronicles does take into account generations of slaves. So Moses was the 10th generation from Levi, his ancestor. And Yahweh said to him again, Now put your hands on your bosom. And when he put his hands on his bosom, and when he took it out, see, his hand was leprous like snow. So leprous was the dread and plague of the ancient world. It was, there was you were forbidden from entering and remaining in the covenant community. If you had leprosy, you were an outlaw, an exile. And this is also the same thing that he, interestingly enough, afflicts his sister Miriam in response to her rebellion against Moses. He strikes her with leprosy for a period of 7 days, and the entire camp is unable to move in response to her being unable to move with it in the 12th chapter of Numbers. But here it's just the hand that is becoming leprous, but it is a sure enough sign that there is something supernatural, someone supernatural speaking to him, and something supernatural working for him on his behalf. And he said, "Put your hand in your bosom again." So he put his hand in his bosom again, and drew it out of his bosom, and see, it was restored like the other flesh. So just like that, it reverts to what it once was upon the signal of returning his hand to his bosom. So he put it there the first time. His hand became leprous. It became withered. It became diseased. It became nothing pleasant to have or look at or experience or just be in the vicinity of, because it is contagious. That is why the lepers were forbidden from setting foot in the covenant community. But it's just returned. It's healthy, it's whole, it's normal, it's functional, it's operational. It is just as it once was upon returning to his hand to his bosom the second time. And it shall be, if they do not believe you, nor listen to the voice of the first sign, they shall believe the voice of the latter sign. So interestingly enough, divinity has to speak to certain people several times in their lives before they embrace the calling, and he does speak to us in subtle ways, imperceptible promptings of the conscience, which only in hindsight we gain the subterranean supernatural insight to things of the Spirit are proved by the Spirit. But the other thing I want to concentrate on is the word sign or miracle, and it's alternately translated as wonders. Now, miracles are not the mere, in the Bible, miracles are not the mere manipulation of matter for awe, trickery, or amazement. They are designed for a providential purpose. They are designed to do one of five things, the first of which is to demonstrate authority, the second of which is to provide assurance, the third of which is to bear testimony, the fourth of which is to give warning, and the fifth of which is to stimulate faith. Now, these can be combined in certain miracles, but it's one of these five purposes at least that motivates a miracle. So the extremity of these miracles were necessary and appropriate given the extremity of the Hebrew people's entrenched, enslaved conditions. And it shall be, if they do not believe even these two signs, or listen to your voice, then you shall take away water from the river, and pour it on the dry land. And the water which you take from the river shall become blood on the dry land. So this is the first plague. This foretells the first plague of Egypt, which is where Aaron puts his staff on the Nile River, turns the whole thing into blood. And Pharaoh's, this is in the 7th chapter of Exodus, Pharaoh's magicians, they duplicate the miracle in a smaller basin of water, so they are not impressed. They do not receive the signal. Their heart becomes hardened, and they are strangely unaware that a supernatural power is working on the oppressed, enslaved people's behalf, and you are powerless to resist it. You can only resist it for so long. And Moses said to Yahweh, O Yahweh, I am not a man of words, neither before nor since you have spoken to your servants, for I am slow of speech and slow of tongue. Now, somewhere else in the Bible, I forget precisely where Moses is described. I think it's the 7th chapter of Acts. In Stephen's speech, he describes Moses as mighty in signs and words and works. So whether by measure of the words that he wrote, he wrote the foundational book of the Bible in the Old Testament, the first five, the Law, the Torah, the Pentateuch. So whether by that or by wonders, he was the most prolific saint in the Old Testament. Yet he was not a natural speaker, so there is a difference between the writing word and the spoken word. And he public speaking is not a natural thing to most people. In fact, it is dreaded. So even though Yahweh gives us most of us, the power to speech, there are some who are mute for no one's fault, certainly not his. but he does not distribute his gifts evenly. Not all of us are adept with the tongue, and Moses was not a naturally gifted, polished orator, at least in this stage in his life. He's provided and promised the provision of Aaron to serve as his prophet, to speak for him at Pharaoh. But as the signs in the narrative progresses, we witness more and more Moses speaking to Pharaoh himself, taking matters into his own hands. And Yahweh said, "Who has made man's mouth, or who makes it dumb or deaf or seeing or blind? Is it not I, Yahweh? Yahweh is our creator, and as such he gives us the ability to speak and the ability to speak well. Not more of us have the ability to speak. Not all of us have the ability to speak well, because the sovereign source of spiritual gifts does not distribute them evenly, but he can still work wonders through the I am not. Now Moses was focused on his imperfections and inadequacies, and he was focusing on the I am not rather than focusing on the I am. He was focusing inwardly when he should have been focusing above and beyond himself. So he gave him the power and the capacity. Moses is going to be surprised by his ability to speak as this deliverance progresses. And now go, and I shall be with your mouth and teach you what to say. So this is a commission. He's now sending him off. He's given him his task to do. He's proven himself. He revealed his name. He revealed his purpose. He revealed the fact that Israel's prayers had reached his ears, and he was going to step in and take over and intervene dramatically to accomplish their deliverance. Now he's sending Moses as his human vessel to be the one through whom Yahweh will perform the signs and wonders, which will eventually culminate in their deliverance. But he has the assurance that he will be with him when he speaks. This is a similarly fantastic assurance is found in the New Testament, when the Savior promises to the disciples, both present and future, that when you are dragged before the Gentile kings to give a witness of my name, take no premeditation, for the Ruach Kodesh will be there with you in that moment in time. So, but he's also assured that he will speak with his power and his presence. His words will not be his own. His deeds will not be his own, and he will be taught. And he will. He is described as the meekest man who ever lived in Numbers 12:3. So he was teachable because he was meek. So we want to remain teachable and not stop at what we learned yesterday, but keep progressing inexorably in our spiritual and theological walk. But he said, Yahweh, please send by the hand of him whom you would send. So he's asking for someone else. He's asking for a relinquishment of the responsibility. He just doesn't want to do it. He doesn't have the heart in it, even though he just beheld the sight of this magnificent and heard this profound voice and beheld this profound visible presence. He's still looking at the task ahead when he's going in, and he thinks he's going to be alone. So, he wants someone else, anyone but me. He wants to forsake his calling, but Yahweh's not going to let him. So he overcomes, the I am overcomes Moses' I am not. So he thinks he's disqualified, but to reduce it to a cliche, Yahweh does not call the qualified, he qualifies the calls. So Moses, in fact, becomes, especially by the book of Deuteronomy, he becomes an eloquent and polished speaker. Deuteronomy is the farewell sermon that he gave, and he spoke it all, and it was recorded as such. And the displeasure of Yahweh burned against Moses, and he said, Is not Aaron the Levite your brother? I know that he speaks well, and see, he is also coming out to meet you. And when he sees you, he shall be glad in his heart. So Moses did have an older brother, Aaron. He was 3 years older than him. He was 83 when Moses was 80, and he was a Levite of the tribe of Levites. The fact of his Levitical birth is mentioned in the first verse of the second chapter. Moses's, that is. So through Aaron, who Moses hadn't seen, he must have had some awareness of him, but he certainly wasn't living with him. He was in Midian. Aaron was in Egypt and in bondage. but he's going to come with him and accompany him all the way to the palace to be his spokesman and mouthpiece, because he is more eloquent and polished. Now, Moses, probably didn't have a speech impediment or anything like that. He probably just got frozen and frightened when it was time, when he did not have the words at present that he would speak in the future, but he had the assurance that Yahweh would be with him and he would speak what he taught him on the way. And, of course, he's going to be glad in heart when he sees his brother, his younger brother, who did not go through the life of the slave as he did, but is also wanted on the run. He's going to be thrilled just to learn that he's alive, because he had fled Egypt as a fugitive. And he shall speak for you to the people, and it shall be that he will be a mouth for you, and you shall be an Elohim for him. So Elohim himself is declaring that Moses will be the equivalent to Elohim in the sense that he will have a prophet. So just as Moses is Yahweh's mouthpiece, so too will Aaron be Moses' mouthpiece. At least that's how it starts. And the people will be persuaded because they know and trust Aaron. He's one of them. He wasn't raised, this pampered prince who became a shepherd and killed an Egyptian taskmaster in open field. That's when Moses tried to liberate Israel through his own hands and by his own efforts, and it sent him away for 40 years. Now he's been equipped and prepared from his experiences as a Midianite shepherd. And take this rod in your hand with which you shall do the sign. So the same rod which performed the first was the vessel and instrument through which the first sign was made. Remember, it turned into a snake, and then he put his hand on the snake and it reverted back into a rod. As long as this is in your hand, this is going to be the instrument. So hold on tight to this. Do not let it go. Do not let anyone take it from you, but keep it in your hands, because this is going to be the functionally essential foundation for the signs and wonders that I have promised to perform through you. And Moses had already seen a miracle in itself as a theophany, and he had just seen several miracles in rapid succession, and he was about to perform a lot of these miracles. So remember the 5 things for which miracles are designed to do. They're designed to demonstrate authority, provide assurance, bear testimony, give warning, or to stimulate faith. We're going to take off the remainder of this chapter in another lesson. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.